to the third of 3 lectures celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Climate Impacts Group. I'm Amy Snover, Director of the Climate Impacts Group, and I'm glad you could join us tonight. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Coast Salish people of the land where the University of Washington is now located. This is the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. A quick aside here, tonight we're going to be using a service called Poll Everywhere to learn a little bit more about you, the folks who are joining us tonight. So please take a second to find your phone and text UWCIG to 22333, or open a browser window and visit the Poll Everywhere website. We'll put these instructions in the chat. So let's get going. As I said, I'm Amy Snover, and I'm Director of the Climate Impacts Group. As you may know, the Climate Impacts Group was founded in 1995 to develop a better understanding of how climate affects life in the Northwest, and to help policymakers, resource managers, and others use that knowledge to build climate resilience for people and nature in the region. Since we started in 1995, our team has identified climate trends specific to the Northwest and highlighted how climate fluctuations affect our economies, ecosystems, and communities. We have worked with partners across the region to support science-based approaches to addressing climate risks. And we are the proud parents of over 250 Climate Impacts Group alumni who are drawing on their experiences in connecting science and society in over 20 states and provinces and 4 countries. I started with the Climate Impacts Group in the middle of earning my PhD in chemistry at the UW, when I was searching for a career that was more closely related to what mattered most to me. I'd taken a leave of absence from graduate school to figure out my next steps and got myself hired at the brand new Climate Impacts Group. My role was to help convene the first conference on the impacts of climate change on the Northwest, part of a nationwide series organized by the White House. This was back in 1996, and after I went back and finished my degree, I've been here pretty much ever since. As we celebrate our 25th anniversary and the Northwest's progress towards climate resilience, I want to acknowledge all of the people who have contributed to our team's success and to progress in the region over the years, particularly the man who made much of what we're talking about today possible, Professor Ed Miles, who created the Climate Impacts Group in 1995. Ed's vision and leadership established a new way of doing science in service to society that guides our team's work every day. Thank you, Ed, for your vision, foresight, and all you have done for the region. I miss you every day. As climate change accelerates and its consequences become ever more apparent, the urgency to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and build resilience to warming's impacts has never been greater. Our team is excited to share some of our hope, our vision, and our urgency with you tonight as we look forward to our next 25 years. And we also want to hear from you. So here are some of the ways you can participate tonight. We'll be using the Q&A function this evening to field your questions for the speakers. I think we have another slide that shows that one. So please type your questions into the Q&A box in Zoom at any point during the event. You can see the arrow down there to the Q&A box. Put them in at any time and we'll draw on them later in the evening. If you notice any technical issues during the panel, please let us know by typing that in the chat box. And you can also use the chat box to share your general thoughts and ideas. We'll put this information in chat so you can remember. So now we're also going to be using Poll Everywhere to learn more about you, and we can go to that slide. So we have all of you who've taken the time to join us tonight, and I'd like to hear from you about what a climate resilient future means to you in a word. So grab your phone. If you haven't yet set it up, then you can see the instructions at the top. Text UWCIG to 22333. and then text your answer, or you can use your browser. So what does a climate resilient future mean to you? Hope, equitable, protecting transitions. Do I get to enter mine? I think I might. I think I won't enter mine. I'll just comment on everyone's. This is so fun. I love these word clouds. I know this is quick. I didn't give you a lot of time to grab your phone, but look at how fast people are. So we're seeing sustainable justice. That was at the beginning and has been here still strong. Hope, community. Let's see, what are some of the other ones? Restorative, wildlife, healthy, adaptation, prepared, peace. These are really great. You can see, this is great. I could do this all night, but let's, beavers. That is a great example. There's really good stories from that one. Restorative, I think I said already. Intersectional, save the human race. Comfort. All right, let's move to the second question. That was what poll one was, what does a climate resilient future mean to you? Now we're asking, what feelings do you associate with climate change and resilience? So you don't need to reset it up, you just need to text your answer or enter your answer at the browser. So what are some of your feelings? Oh no, frustration, futile. I'm seeing some come in the chat for people who aren't able to do that. Anger, courage. Curiosity. I don't think I would have said that, but I like that. I like what that, the frame of mind that puts me in. Anxiety, defiance, denial, love, sadness, concern. Look at the big ones. Anxiety, hope, concern, and collaboration. A lot of that for me is, a lot of these feelings for me are kind of the flip side of each other, right? What do we do with anxiety? We work to strengthen hope. What do we do when we're concerned or alone? We consider how else we can collaborate. Teamwork. That's a great one to end this poll on, because tonight we're going to be talking about some of the results of teamwork across our group and across the whole region. So lots of dimensions to climate change, lots of components to both, I think, what we hope a resilient future looks like and our concerns and hopes about whether and how we'll find the path towards that. So I'm hoping that this evening we are going to be able to provide you some additional flesh on those ideas and thinking about some of the answers towards how we look forward with hope and anticipation. So at this point, I would like to introduce my co-host, Chip Giller. Chip is the founder of Grist, which is an online media platform devoted to environmental news and views, for which he has won numerous awards. Because Grist was among the first publications to draw connections between the environment and such areas as food, economics, and health, I'm excited to have Chip join us this evening to help us show the widespread linkages and challenges associated with climate resilience. Chip is also a member of the advisory board for Earth Lab, our parent organization, and working today to help support young leaders in helping us find a way towards a sustainable future through the Grist 50 Fixers program. So thank you for joining us, Chip, and I'm going to hand it to you to take it away.
Great. Well, thanks, Amy. I'm so excited to be here. I think the work of the Climate Impacts Group, the work that it does is so important and so vital now more than ever. And as we look back 25 years ago, I think you guys were so ahead of your time, and so is now certainly a vital contributor to this time too. So thank you guys so much. So we're going to have a couple of components to this evening. During the first half, 5 scientists from the Climate Impacts Group will be delivering lightning talks on future directions for their work, and I'm really excited to hear from all of them. We'll be joined by Andrew Shirk, Crystal Raymond, Erica Asinas, Guillaume Auger, and Mead Crosby. So I'll give you a little bit more information on each of them before their talks. And then after they've given their lightning rounds, in the second half of this time together, Amy will return and we'll have a conversation about the future of the Climate Impacts Group and the future of climate resilience. And we'll be taking questions from you all. So at this point, so it's pretty straightforward. And as Amy said earlier, I just want to reinforce, use the Q&A function to submit questions at that point, but that'll be in the second half of the evening. But at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Andrew Shirk. He's a research scientist in conservation biology. So Andrew's mission is to use innovative science to inform the successful conservation of species and habitats, even amidst climate change. So Andrew, over to you. Super excited to learn from you.
Thanks, Chip, and hey, everybody. So when I was a kid, I used to lay on my back at night and look up at the sky for satellites. And it just captured my imagination when I saw one. And it's funny to me all these years later, as an ecologist, I spent a lot of my time looking back down at Earth from the perspective of satellites. I use satellite data to build models that help guide conservation planning for species and habitats that are at risk from climate change and from our expanding human footprint. The satellite view of the glow of our cities at night, it just shows how much we've transformed our planet. And of course, our climate is also changing rapidly, forcing many species to move to track suitable conditions over time. And when they move, they have to navigate a path over all this space and distance that avoids risks posed by our cities, by our highways, and by our industries. It's astounding how fast conditions are changing on the ground. I mean, over the span of just a few decades, we can see glaciers melting, cities are growing, and industries like agriculture and logging are expanding to meet increased demand. And so we live in an incredibly dynamic world that literally changes every year. The rapid pace of change now often exceeds the speed at which we can make conservation plans to adapt to these impacts. And so it just takes time to produce the data sets and the models that we need to assess risks. It takes time to design management strategies to mitigate those risks. And it takes time to monitor and evaluate and adjust our plans. So all of these steps, they involve a massive amount of data that's processed manually, every time we go around the circle at great expense. So this cycle can take, given all those realities, it can take a decade to go through this cycle. And that's just, we get quickly behind the curve when we're seeing widespread changes every year when our planning cycle takes a decade. Our plans just can't keep up. So my vision for the next 25 years is to expand our approach to conservation in the 21st century, to harness recent advances in cloud computing and remote sensing and artificial intelligence, and speed the cycle up and get ahead of the curve. I want to see new tools that can automatically monitor annual changes in vegetation and land cover over broad regional scales, dynamically update habitat and connectivity models that inform our conservation plans, prioritize areas for conservation actions like building wildlife crossing structures over highways at key locations, and ultimately help managers design a connected and resilient landscape that retains ecological functioning over time. All of this might seem futuristic and very aspirational, but in fact, we're already putting the pieces in place to make this happen right now. There's a growing constellation of Earth-observing satellites that are producing a massive amount of data to track changing conditions that affect wildlife. And Google has developed the Earth Engine platform, which links these satellite data and other data sets to a cloud-based supercomputer that can do planetary scale spatial analysis and modeling. These technologies are the foundation of a new web-based spatial planning tool called Teradapt that we're developing in collaboration with Google and the Cascadian Partner Forum, which is a Northwest regional conservation climate adaptation organization. Teradapt will dynamically monitor habitat, connectivity, and project future impacts of climate change for at-risk species and habitats. And it will prioritize areas for conservation actions that increase resiliency. And this will add a regional scale transboundary perspective that will complement the more local scale conservation efforts already underway. Automating this process in the Google Cloud is cost effective and it's fast, so it allows our plans to keep pace with the change we're seeing every year. Amount of time, I wish I had more time to tell you about this, but that's it for now. And I'll just point you towards a couple websites where you can learn more about Teradapt and how it's getting connected to decision-making as part of the Cascadia Partner Forum's climate adaptation strategy. And I also want to thank our funders that share our vision and have made all of this work possible. And just thank you all for celebrating with us tonight. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andrew. Okay, as we said, these are lightning rounds that definitely left me yearning for more information. So maybe we'll circle back to learn more about that. Super enticing and informative. So next we're going to hear from Dr. Guillaume Mauger. He's a research scientist in climate and hydrology who joined the Climate Impacts Group as a postdoc in 2009. Guillaume works to enable effective floodplain management in the face of climate change. So welcome.
All right, thanks, Chip. And good job pronouncing my name. Thank you. So I am, as Chip said, here to talk about flooding and our work helping communities plan and prepare for climate change. And I want to start by talking about three basic factors that we think about when we're assessing the risk to climate change in any situation. You can go to the next slide. And these are really the three questions we're looking at when we're assessing climate change risks. One, how much change is going to happen? Two, when does it matter, or how much would it have to change to matter? Three, what is our capacity or our ability to adapt? So I am a numbers geek at heart, and so I've naturally gravitated towards that first one, quantifying what those changes are on the landscape when we're looking at flooding. And as I've done this work over the years, especially in the last couple of years, I've really realized how important these other two components of risk are. And I've really started to think about how we can expand on that work. And that's where I see, this is my punchline for my 5 minutes. That's where I see our work really expanding over the next 25 years. I think that first one's going to continue to be important, but we have a lot of new work and exciting work we can grow into in those latter two. So you can go to the next slide, please. All right, so I wanted to give you an example of each of these to sort of illustrate what I'm talking about. And this is just one example. This is from a colleague. This is one example of that first piece, how much change is going to happen. This is from my colleague, Alan Hamlet. And what it's showing is the 100-year flood. It's showing both where the water goes and how deep it is in the lower Skagit Valley. These are screenshots from a web tool that he produced. And you can actually scroll through this. This is showing the current 100-year flood, but if you scroll to the next slide, you'll see it is in the middle of the century, and then the slide after that shows the end of the century. So this is just one example I wanted to show. It's one example of how we take the generalized global climate model projections and try to localize them and target them as specifically as possible on what would be needed in order to plan or make decisions related to climate change. And this, like I said, is where I've spent most of my time in the 12 years since I've been at the Climate Impacts Group. And I think I can think of we're continuously trying to refine and expand on this approach. And this isn't going to go away. This is going to be important. It has been important. It is important now. And this kind of work is going to be important for the next 25 years as well. But it's been well represented in our work. And so the next two are the ones where I see really the potential for expansion. So here's that second one that I mentioned. When does it matter, or how much change has to happen to matter? And this image is one example. So just to sort of lay it out there, it's one thing to know how much the river levels are rising in the future. It's another thing to know how much they have to rise to flood I-5, right? And you can think of a lot of other examples like that, your floorboards in your house, right? Or non-flood examples, right? And so this perspective has gotten some attention in the past, all of these have, but not nearly as much, and certainly not as much in my work. And I'm seeing a lot of potential for it. And I think there's two real exciting parts to me about this piece. And the first is that what this really involves more than anything is local expertise, from residents or managers, much more so than my expertise or any kind of climate change specific expertise. And the second piece that I find exciting about this piece is that we can learn a lot by looking backwards at the events that we've seen in the past. It looks like floods or heat waves or years that were warmer than the average, and thinking about how much those may happen more often in the future or be more intense in the future in order to put them in the climate change context. Okay. So that's the second one. And so before I talk about the third, could you go back one there? Thank you. The one after that one. There we go. So before I talk about the third one, I want to talk just about floodplains more broadly. I think everybody's well aware of this, but there's a lot of really valuable aspects to floodplains. And this image really highlights the agricultural value of floodplains. It's also visible there, maybe less so, but habitat is huge in floodplains. And that's not just riverine habitat, but also coastal, which you can see here. It's also not just aquatic species, but also land-based species. It's just a really rich what you find in the floodplains. And please go to the next slide. There's also, other human aspects, right? There's a lot of critical infrastructure, valuable property. It's also a place where a lot of cultural, culturally valuable areas and recreation happen. So there's a lot of value in floodplains. And there's also a lot of interests. And that kind of leads to this third piece, which is what is our capacity or ability to adapt? And it's that third component of the risk posed by climate change. And this is really where the rubber meets the road in thinking about climate change risks and our ability to respond to them, right? Because it's things like economic resources, or what are the institutions that are responsible for change? It's who's part of the discussions. It's what kind of community support there is. And this is something that I have just realized in the past couple of years needs a lot more attention in my work. And I think in the field in general, we're realizing more and more needs more attention. I think it's where I think there's a lot of potential for expanding, in part because this is where a lot of the barriers to acting on climate change are. So I want to just finish with one final thought, which is that I think this is also the place where a lot of the equity and justice questions come in. Who's involved in conversations about planning and risks? Who, are those needs prioritized? Does that translate into action? And so on. But I'll stop there and looking forward to the rest of the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Guillaume. Yeah, we're already seeing all the variety of work going on in the climate impacts group, and it's just such a myriad approach, and that's so important. And we're talking about climate change, which is such a complex issue. So number 3 coming up, we have Dr. Crystal Raymond. She's a climate adaptation scientist who has a degree in ecosystem analysis. Crystal works to enable decision makers and resource managers to weigh the impacts of climate change in their work. So welcome, Crystal.
Great, thank you, Chip, and thank you to everyone for being here tonight. Next slide. So to talk about the future of climate resilience, what I see is important for the next 25 years, I want to start by talking a little bit about my journey in working on climate resilience over the last 10 years. I started working on climate resilience with federal land managers working to understand the vulnerability and sensitivity of ecosystems in our national forests and national parks in the Northwest. And we worked very closely with land managers to understand how these ecosystems may be affected and what options and actions we can take to ensure that they continue to thrive as the climate changes. And I think a lot of work in the Northwest really has focused on these natural systems for good reason. They're a big part of our character here in the Northwest. A lot of people associated with them, and they are very sensitive to the impacts of climate change. Next slide. And they're also a place that I really value and found a lot of reward in working in these places. I spent a lot of time mountain biking, climbing, skiing in these natural environments. And there's a lot of great reward to knowing that these areas are going to continue to be preserved and to function as the climate changes. And next slide. And I think as doing that work, as important as it is, we also did not do enough to focus on the rural communities that surround those natural lands. And this was often not included in part of the conversation. And the fourth National Climate Assessment identifies the frontline communities of the Northwest, and they include in that definition rural communities, and particularly those that are dependent on natural resources for their livelihoods. And I think this is one of the most important areas of our climate resilience work in the next 25 years, is to understand how we bring rural communities, those that are less resourced and have not yet prioritized climate resilience, more into the adaptation planning process for the region as a whole. Next slide. And we know that adaptation actions and responses in these rural communities and in communities and human systems in general looks really different than it does in natural systems. I'm a fire ecologist by training. I have a lot of experience in understanding the natural role of fire in natural systems and thinking about how, as climate changes and wildfire changes in the future, how do we ensure that wildfire still plays a role in these forest ecosystems, and forest ecosystems can respond to that. Next slide. But when rural communities are thinking about adapting to changes in wildfire, the actions and the concerns that they think about are really different. Rural communities are thinking about how to evacuate, how to respond in the event of a wildfire, how to rebuild their communities, how to deal with the health effects of smoke. And so I think one of the most important factors in the next 25 years when we think about resilience is thinking about the differences in adaptation in rural and natural systems and how we ensure that those are not at odds with each other and are able to function together. Next slide. And my experience with climate resilience has also taken me to our very urban environments here in the city of Seattle and in King County. And I've done a lot of work in these urban environments on building resilience. And a lot of progress has been made. We see that these communities are well on their way in doing resilience work. And what we need to do now is to be able to expand our capacity to work with communities that are less resourced. Next slide. And I think as we think about working with these rural communities in the next 25 years, there's some really important differences that we need to recognize. Typically, these communities have not prioritized climate resilience. And there's a lot of good reasons for that. Some of it political, some of it is just, basic focusing on basic needs and necessities. And so I think that in order to successfully bring rural communities more into the process, and that we need to reframe the issue in climate resilience to be more connected to the values that these communities have and recognize the strong sense of self-resilience and sense of place that these communities have. And if we're not able to connect to climate resilience, I mean, these are the places where we're most likely to have challenges because we know they're most vulnerable and on the front lines of climate change. And I think, the thing that I want to stress the most and that I'll end with is also recognizing that it's taken us 25 years to get where we're at with the resilience building in urban communities. And when we think about working more with rural communities and how many communities across the Northwest are in need of work to do resilience building, we need to recognize that we don't have the luxury of taking another 25 years to get there. And so as we think about how to do it in these places, despite having less resources and not yet being part of the process, we need to think a lot about how we can accelerate the process and make this happen faster so that it doesn't take another 25 years.
Thanks, Crystal. That was, yeah, I'm sort of, sorry guys, I'm not being super eloquent, but I'm just finding there's such variety, and there's such, you'll hear from Erica shortly, such a variety of backgrounds too involved with Climate Impacts Group. So Erica's next, Erica Asinas, and she's a research scientist and a project manager who has a master's in city and regional planning. Erica's mission is to promote equity in climate adaptation. So welcome, Erica.
Thanks, Chip, and hi, everybody. So, the next 25 years, building a climate resilient future is something that will require all of us. What this means is that there will be people who are working within power structures, within systems, and people who are working outside of these structures, both for that shared vision. And in my short career working towards climate resilience, I've been able to experience what it's like to work towards this future from both sides of the court. As a first-generation Filipina immigrant and spending the earlier part of my career working for nonprofits and community-based organizations on environmental justice issues, I've experienced working on the outside. And today, I find myself as a social scientist at the University of Washington, working inside a large established system. So I'm sharing with you my perspective on both. Next slide. So inside these systems where we're at, in the context of academia, I think we have a professional and ethical imperative to be honest brokers of science. But to date, I think that most longstanding institutions have yet to fulfill this mission. And this is largely due to the fact that much of our science and the foundations of our work today is still based off of and centers Western experiences and ways of knowing. Academia and the field of climate adaptation in itself is embedded in historically white patriarchal systems that are larger than myself or any individual. Historically, this has led to the exclusion of non-white knowledge systems and the erasure and marginalization of Black, Indigenous, feminist, and people of color perspectives, people who have both experiential and technical wisdom that are critical to this conversation. On a more personal level, as a woman of color, this has meant that I don't often see myself represented or reflected in the legacy of the field that I'm working in. But I'm slowly seeing that change. So though we have ways to go, the Climate Impacts Group is a woman-led organization, and I do see spaces for me and people like me emerging in the field. There's also growing recognition that top-down institutional hierarchies are not sufficient, and we need intersectional thinking to move forward. Next. As a social scientist, how I see this change manifesting in my work is the move towards doing community-based research better and with more integrity. This means that the people most impacted by climate change aren't tokenized, but equal partners in developing the questions and answers. More specifically, at the Climate Impacts Group, in my work with Guillaume in several watersheds, we're working with farmers, tribal members, and other local stakeholders to develop a research agenda that aligns with their needs. More broadly, in our other work, we're also designing new efforts to build climate resilience that is jointly led by scientists and community organizations that includes diverse perspectives from leadership to engagement and recognizing our role as helpers or as partners rather than as experts or leaders. Next. Next slide. Okay, so on the outside of these systems, where I think we're at is we are living in this incredible moment in time where there is more recognition of climate change than ever before. matching that with technology, people now have the capacity to rapidly self-organize, decentralize knowledge, and crowdsource power. As Andrew mentioned in his presentation, we're still learning how to harness all of that. But as a young scientist, it's really exciting and motivating for me to know that the work I'm doing isn't happening in a bubble, and it's contributing to a larger movement. Simultaneously, and through my own lived experience, when you're working with no authority and outside of systems, it can often feel like pushing against a wall. I've seen many people, including myself, experience burnout because of it. Next. But this is changing, and having played both sides of the court, I know that the struggle isn't for nothing. The outside game plays a big role in shaping the inside game. The changing social cultural landscape that movement building lends itself to allows scientists and researchers like myself to push the boundaries of what we can do from the inside. At the Climate Impacts Group, I see this in how our work is becoming increasingly responsive to frontline communities, as Crystal showed in her presentation. And this shows up in who we partner with and how we partner with them. And what we learn from that process also allows us to influence and shift the way we work with other institutions like government and policymakers. Next. And then with all that being said, what I'm starting to see, and I hope to see in the next 25 years, is people working from both sides, challenging these boundaries and disrupting divisive systems. And I think that when we're co-creating the ways in which we understand the problem and design the solutions, when we're working in collaboration and in community, that's when a climate resilient future not only becomes possible, but the journey of getting there becomes transformative, healing, and joyous. Thank you.
Thanks, Erica. Thanks for sharing so openly and honestly, and for really pointing a way forward. So finally, with these lightning rounds, batting last but not least, at number 5, we have Dr. Mead Crosby, who's a senior scientist and a biologist by training. Mead's mission is to support governments and communities in equitably conserving biodiversity in a changing world. Welcome, Mead.
Thank you. So I'm a conservation biologist, and I work with national parks, with tribes, conservation nonprofits, and a whole bunch of other kinds of entities to help reduce climate risks and improve resilience for species and ecosystems. A little background, I was trained in basic research, or what you might call pure science or unapplied science, and focused on ecology and evolutionary biology. So earlier in my career, for my PhD work, I looked at how past changes in climate shaped how species are formed, where we find them around the globe, and how they interact. And my brain loved this work, but ultimately, my heart couldn't bear to work on such beautiful intellectual problems when the very species and ecosystems that I was studying and the people who depend on them were facing such urgent crises, the dual crises of climate change and extinction. And so over a decade ago, I switched gears and I started working with decision makers to help them manage species and ecosystems in ways that could help boost their resilience to climate change. And one of the really great things about this work is that it can help us tackle multiple problems at once. Next slide. So nature is in fact a powerful climate solution itself. Managing, protecting, and restoring habitats can provide up to 1/3 of the carbon mitigation that we need to meet the Paris goal of keeping warming under 2 degrees Celsius. And managing, protecting, and restoring habitats is also exactly what we need to be doing to help reverse biodiversity loss and restore the ecosystems that people depend on for their health and well-being. Next slide. It also happens that ambitious habitat conservation is hugely popular. So for example, 86% of US voters support a national goal of conserving 30% of US lands and waters by 2030. So you might have heard of this, the 30 by 30 initiative. And this is hugely supported on both sides of the aisle. So 76% of Republicans, 94% of Democrats, everyone agrees they want to see this done. So how do we actually get this done? How should we be doing this work? Well, I and probably most of the folks who work in this area, I think, would agree that the most equitable and robust approaches will come from working with communities, being science informed. And we have a really great example of this right here in the Northwest. Next slide. So the Cascadian Climate Adaptation Strategy, which I and many of my colleagues at the Climate Impacts Group are helping to support, is an example of the kind of large-scale, community-driven, science-informed conservation efforts that we need to help tackle the dual crises of climate change and extinction. So the strategy is aimed at supporting the resilience of Cascadia's natural systems in the face of rapid landscape change. And the pace and the scale of the changes that we're seeing are stressing the ability of Cascadia's natural resource managers, so the folks who manage our natural lands, our fish, and our wildlife, it's stressing their ability to meet their missions of conserving our natural systems. And this is exacerbated by the fact that, next slide, our natural lands in Cascadia, which for this purpose is most of the area around Washington, British Columbia, right across the border, it is managed as a large patchwork of many, many individual jurisdictions that each act as islands in the sea of rapid landscape change, when what we need is for them to be all working together in large-scale coordinated action to maintain the resilience of our landscapes. Next slide. And this is exactly what the Cascadia Climate Adaptation Strategy is being developed to do. So the strategy is going to help identify specific actions that can help support the capacity, the motivation, the coordination, policies, and funding that we'll need to achieve resilience at the scale and pace of climate change in our region. And it's being led by the Cascadia Partner Forum, which is a network of local natural resource managers and stakeholders from across Washington and British Columbia, spanning federal, state, provincial government, tribes, First Nations, conservation nonprofits, and other stakeholders. So the strategy is incorporating both Western and Indigenous knowledges and local knowledge, and as well as helping to co-develop some really cutting edge science with the Terra Adapt tool that Andrew talked about earlier, so that we always have the very latest information about our rapidly changing landscape, so that we can monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of the actions that we take together as we work to conserve the resilience of Cascadia's natural systems and the people who depend on them. Next slide. So the Cascadia Climate Adaptation Strategy is a demonstration of how community sits at the very heart of climate resilience. So equitable, robust, and enduring climate solutions are only going to come from centering communities in resilience efforts. And at the same time, working in community and toward climate justice lends meaning and purpose to our work as we go through the challenge of tackling something as difficult as climate change, and in this case, extinction. And I will say that personally, I have found no better antidote to the anxiety and the grief that can come with the challenges we face today than by taking action together ambitiously in community and in pursuit of justice. And so if you're concerned about climate change, if this is something that you struggle with, I would just highly encourage you to find your communities, and I know they're out there, in taking climate action together. Thank you.
Thanks, Mead. That was a great way to wrap up the lightning rounds. And so I expect we'll have each of you back, because that was so much fodder, but just touching on your work. At this point, I'd like to invite Amy back on. And I have some questions to start us off, and then we'll open it up to all of you in the audience to get things going. But I just wanted to say, wow, Amy, I so appreciate what you guys are doing, and I'm so grateful. It's such important stuff and such a mix. And yeah, so, and so I'm wondering how you juggle it all. But first, I wanted just to ask you a little bit more about your background, Amy. You mentioned that you were kind of there toward the start of the Climate Impacts Group, and you kind of took a fork in your path because you wanted to be doing work that had practical applications. But I'm kind of curious, like, what in your past, did you grow up in the Pacific Northwest? What drove you to want to be an impacts person?
Yeah, thanks for giving me time to tell that story too. I think I like many, but not all of us on the team. I grew up in the Northwest. I moved here when I was about 3, and I grew up as a child of the outdoors. My parents basically raised us to be outside most of the time. So hiking, biking, skiing across the Northwest, a lot in Washington, from the dry deserts to the wet coast. And I was really motivated by trying to understand how people could live on this planet in a way that allows the planet and the things we love about it to still persist and thrive. And so that's my main motivation. And then another part of it for me was that I kind of like being in between. I like translating and connecting things. And I like trying to talk about, things that one community understands and translate them for another. I remember when I was growing up and having a hard time with math and asking my dad for help, and then I'd say, "Oh, don't mind, Dad, I figured it out." And he'd say, "Well, explain it to me." And I'm like, no, I can't explain it, but I understand it. And he'd say, if you can't explain it, you don't understand it. So I always take that to heart too. And a lot of our mission and what I actually love doing is figuring out ways to talk about things in very different environments.
How do you, and what does your day-to-day look like, Amy? We just heard 5 such different approaches that are all under the umbrella of the Climate Impacts Group. I'm wondering, what your day-to-day is, but how do you guys choose and prioritize the work that you're doing?
That is a great question, and it's something we talk about a lot. So, to back up, right? We're a science-based organization, and yet we have a mission to help build climate resilience for people and nature in the Northwest. And so what we want to do is improve our understanding of how climate variability and climate change actually manifest on the landscape, how big the floods will be, which wildlife will be affected, how all those things, and then support people in using that information. So for a long time, our priority has been based on the urgency of the issue. So every day, people are making decisions that set our path towards either climate resilience or climate vulnerability. Every day, people are deciding how to design bridges and what size they should be. Every day, people are thinking about coastal habitat or coastal roadways. Every day, people are building choosing to build in floodplains or draw floodplain lines on a map. You could go on and on about all the things people are doing every day, that if they do them thinking about the climate of the past, we're in trouble. If they do them thinking about the climate of the future and how to make those decisions work in the climate of the future, we'll be on a better path. And so we've really focused on, so who are those decision makers? What are those decisions? And where do they have ability to act? And where can our science not only help one group, but help others? So we have we have these rules of thumb, right? Like, is this some science that really can be used locally, but is broadly applicable? Is this a serious climate vulnerability that is important to address, or is it maybe something we can tackle later? And then, there's the other part of it, which is that we actually need funding to do our work. And so part of our work is based on which federal science agencies are funding science that's related to this work. So for example, NOAA has supported us to do new sea level rise projections and work with communities to help plan for rising seas. And so it's this match between the science, the needs, and the funding from state and federal agencies and private philanthropy that help us prioritize our efforts.
I imagine
It's,
something.
I'll say one more
Yeah.
thing is that it's not as easy as it used to be to do that prioritization because the needs are so great. You know, we're not meeting all the needs. And so, you know, I think there's a huge urgency to sort of invest in, you know, the work that communities need to do to build climate resilience as people really realize how fast climate is changing.
Yeah, I was going to say, Amy, that I imagine compared to 25 years ago, probably some of that work then was persuading people about having to plan for resilience or persuading people we need to adapt. And now I think probably that argument's, one isn't the right term, but resolved. And so now there's probably almost like an excess of requests for your work. So reflecting back on the 5 lightning round talks, I was thinking that one theme that came up that I was thinking about was a sort of almost like a tension of pushing the boundaries of scientific inquiry while also integrating, on the other hand, more community knowledge, communications, sort of the social science perspectives. So I'm wondering what it's like as a scientist to navigate this space. And, you know, would you have anticipated a shift like this earlier in your career?
So I guess the first answer, what's it like as a scientist to navigate this space? I would say it's exhilarating, right?
Yeah.
I mean, when I went to work for Ed in 1996, I got hooked on the challenge and the promise of like developing new ways to put science to use. So, you know, I think throughout the history of Climate Impacts Group, we've sat squarely at this intersection between advancing science and improving decision-making or improving practice on the ground. And so we're always, this is also the other prioritization, we're always looking for that overlap, right? Between where we have questions that we haven't resolved about the future and where people have questions that they need answered for the work that they're doing. So I think one thing that's changed over the course of things is you were mentioning, you know, at the beginning of our time, we didn't know what climate change would mean for the Northwest. We didn't know how much it would warm. We didn't know why it mattered. We didn't know how it would affect wildfires or wildlife. We didn't know any of that. And so a lot of the early work was doing that science. What are the impacts likely to be? And now there's a lot of that science. I mean, it still needs, you know, there's still a lot to develop and a lot of questions to answer, but an increasing amount of our work is in helping people sort of access and interpret and apply that science. Because as more and more communities and organizations get involved in addressing climate change, they're less familiar with the knowledge and tools that already exist. So that wasn't exactly your question about sort of navigating this, but we can go back to that. So yeah.
I mean, and at some point, Amy, I mean, I'll look to you for guidance, but we might maybe bringing in some of the dynamic 5, because I think this is like a central thing going on right now. I mean, how do we kind of give more space and even put, in some cases, like frontline communities at the center of the discussion and in leading roles, which is, I think, probably a different approach, perhaps, from where the Climate Impacts Group started.
Yeah, and maybe Mead can join us when she has a second to turn her camera back on, and tell us a little bit about some of her experience, because it also maps onto your evolution, right, as a scientist in the kind of science and work you've chosen to do.
Oh, I was muted
though.
It's funny because, you know, it was a subtle trajectory. Like I went from doing basic science and not knowing like any decision makers whatsoever, like having no experience outside pretty much of academia and research, to getting really lucky and showing up right when I finished my PhD and I wanted to do my postdoc and was like, okay, well, I've been thinking about how species need to move in the past. and how, you know, movement's so important to adapting to climate change, why don't we think about how species will need to move in the future and how we can make sure that we're managing landscapes to allow species to shift the ranges they need to. And so it happened at the same time I was thinking this, that the Washington Connected Landscapes project started. And this was an effort led by Washington Department of Transportation, Washington Fish and Wildlife, and involved dozens of decision-making entities in the Northwest, or mostly Washington, to figure out how to best conserve our landscapes for wildlife movement. And so I show up at their first meeting, and it's just like, it was like all, you know, every agency, like tribes, like NGOs, it was like all the people I did not know and like desperately wanted to be working with. And they were talking about all the work they were doing, and I like raised my hand. I'm like, well, have you thought about how climate change is going to affect, you know, all the things that you do? They were like, oh, we know that's so important, but we don't have the capacity to do it. I'm like, would you like someone to? And, you know, then I wrote some grants, I got them. And that was my postdoc, was working with this group. And it was like a river that I just stepped into, and it swept me right into my career doing this kind of work. And I think as far, you know, so you know, personally, it was a very abrupt transition to working with decision makers and communities in doing this work. And the thing I have found is that I think the science, it's still incredibly intellectually challenging to do this work. There's still amazing science opportunities in this work. And there's a humility that is required to do this with communities that we are not trained to have as academics, to be blunt. And so for, you know, a lot of the work as a scientist in doing this effectively is really more sort of cultural and in learning, you know, skills around listening and convening and valuing other knowledges as much as we value the Western science we've been trained in, because local knowledge is incredibly important and valuable. Indigenous knowledge is incredibly important and valuable. And so I think more and more this is being recognized, and people are being supported to do this work and bringing those knowledges together, recognizing that they can't just be blended. You can just put a blender on and zip them around. Like they're each distinct and valuable. And so it's, you know, it just takes a lot of mutual respect and listening. And it's, you know, it's still, we're always learning how to do it, because with every community one works with, it's different knowledge, different experience. And so you're always learning.
Thanks, Mead. That's really powerful. I'm wondering, Amy and any of the other panelists who might like to join, I'm wondering, what does a climate resilient future mean to you? Like, what does that look like? What does it feel like? What might, in the year 2040, 2050, what might that feel like? Where do we live? How do we get around? How do we work and play? Big question, I know, but, you know, looking forward 25 more years, where might we be?
It is a big question, and I'm going to invite my colleagues to turn their camera on and unmute and join me in painting a picture if they like. I think, I mean, the first of all, about what does a climate resilient future look like, right, is that we've actually stopped increasing climate change, right? So that's number one. We're talking here tonight about all the science and the work we're doing to prepare for those aspects of climate change that we're not going to be able to avoid. But the number one thing is avoiding making it the problem even worse. So, you know, the other thing about a climate resilient future is, I think, you know, it's got all different kinds of dimensions, as you can tell from all the different talks that you've heard, and they're just scratching the surface of the different kinds of work that we do. But, you know, I think it's a future where we're living out of harm's way, right? Where we're living out of the reach of rising seas and flooding rivers. We're living in cool cities, not urban heat islands. We are adapted or prepared for the kinds of hazards that we should expect. So, you know, my community here in North Central Washington is working on figuring out how to be a fire adapted community, you know, living in the midst of a frequent forest, a forest that is historically frequently burned. So what does that look like? How do we manage a forest? How do we manage our communities to be able to accommodate that? And you know, I think the other aspect that I would say before I hand it over to, I think at least Guillaume, maybe others have things to say, is When I think about what a climate resilient world looks like, it in a way it's a deceptively simple description. Like, I want to get up in the morning and brush my teeth with clean water, and I want to turn on the lights when I need them and breathe clean air all day. I want to ski in the mountains in the winter and hike across this state all summer and fall. You know, I want to eat Washington apples and cherries and drink Washington wine that's grown by farmers whose rural communities are vibrant and thriving. You know, I want Washington to be a place where our natural resources and natural systems still are really play an important role in our culture and economy. I want to live and work in a just and diverse community where that values, supports, and uplifts people. And I want my government to be spending my tax dollars on things that enrich our lives instead of, you know, filling old holes from holes we dug before. So it's not a fancy vision. I think the fancy part is what's under the hood about what we have to do to get there, and the way we need to, you know, restore our systems and actually realign, you know, recognize the pressure that climate change is bringing so that we can steer ourselves in the direction we want to go.
I think it's important to have that North Star, or else it can be pretty disempowering, climate change. I mean, it's sort of easy to almost like freak out, give up, because the problem's so vast. So I think I mean, that vision you painted is so simple, but I think there's an elegance to it. It's a simplicity. And I think it's so important to have that the sort of compass point. Guillaume, did you want to add anything at this point?
Yeah, I mean, everything Amy said is great, and but I had a small thought I wanted to add in, which is just that you know, I think there's a tendency to think about climate change apart from all of the important other things we manage in our day-to-day lives. And I see, you know, and we know in our work, you know, we see this all the time. Climate change isn't climate adaptation is not a one-off thing, right? It's something that you work on iteratively, and, you know, with greater and greater sophistication over time as you need to, or maybe you don't need to get more sophisticated. But it's not something that is one and done. And so when I think about a climate resilient future, I think about getting to a point where in some ways we've worked ourselves out of a job, right? It's something that everybody does as part of their lives, to the point where it's kind of invisible in the same way as a lot of other things, like thinking about your commute to work, right? Yeah. So that's just another piece that I think about with your question.
Amy, I'm just trying to, I have my multiple screens going on here. Amy, so I'm curious, and then maybe after this, we can open it up to questions from the audience, although I have lots more, but I'm curious, like, do you feel like we're doing it enough now? What right now could we be doing differently? What would it look like to be fully engaged, you know, later in 2021 or 2022?
I think so. We've done a lot. We've come a long way. And I think some of our earlier, the panel, especially our first panel, was focused on showing some of the successes that have been happening around the region with new, you know, zoning to address sea level rise and other issues. But to address, you know, directly, no, we're not doing enough. We're absolutely not doing enough. I get the sense that people still kind of think that a climate altered future is optional, and that like climate change is this optional thing to deal with that may or may not really happen. And I think the reality is, you know, we're on a trajectory to a future that does not look like the past, right? We're on a trajectory, just for example, for, you know, by the 2050s, the average temperature for an average year will be hotter than the hottest years of the last century. And climate is sort of sets the foundation for all of life, right? What grows where, what lives where in the natural world is based on the climate of the place. And how we build our houses, how big our dams and reservoirs are, how much power we think we need, what we eat, where it comes from. all of these things are on the foundation of the current and past climate. And so as climate changes, it shakes that foundation and it will change everything. And I don't think we get that yet, right? And so that is our mission, really, one of many, but is to uncover those sensitivities and vulnerabilities so that we can prepare for them. So how much is stream flow going to change at different times of the year? And so therefore, how much hydropower can we make when? That's important information to plan so our cities can have the power they need at the right time. So there's my rant about why it's important to do it. And we could tell, I see Crystal wants to say some things. I hand it to her in a second. There's a lot of progress. I often talk to people about sort of the happy secret of climate adaptation and resilience, which is that there's way more going on than anybody knows. I betcha. Like, we could tell you stories about all kinds of good work that's being done at all levels of government in lots of different communities to think about climate risks. So there's a really good story there. And it's just, we've just scratched the ice, scratched the surface, and we need to do more. Over to
Crystal, do you want to jump in? Yeah.
Yes, I was going to add to Guillaume's comments about, and respond to your question about what does climate resilience look like, a climate resilient future look like. And I would say, in addition to climate resilience work being a part of what people do on a regular basis, part of their, their regular jobs or work, is also just this level of climate change literacy and understanding that people have, that's a part of education, that's a part of what people are trained to do for their jobs, I think is really important. And also, and even before we get there, there's a certain element of realizing that in order to have that climate resilience future, we're going to also need equitable access to the resources, and that not all communities, all places around the Northwest have the same capacity to take advantage of the resources that we do have. And so I think part of a climate resilience future is figuring out, how we can achieve that and how we can make those resources available to any communities or counties or cities or towns or tribes that need those resources.
We have a question that sort of builds on that. So in your work with local communities, anyone who wants to answer, maybe starting with you, Amy, what adaptation strategies are starting to find the most traction?
That is a good question. And I see people also thinking that. I want to just begin by saying that I go back to one thing Crystal said about, the decades that we've been working to sort of advance our and others' understanding of climate risks and to catalyze preparation for them. And what that has showed us is that there's a lot of work to do for communities to really understand which threads climate pulls on for them. Or my other analogy, right? When climate changes the foundation, where are the cracks going to be for those communities? So there's been a lot of work in trying to understand climate risks. And so the sort of assessment of risks and planning for them, and fewer examples of adaptation in action. But I imagine other people have some ideas. So let's see. We haven't heard from Erica yet. Maybe. Sorry, Chip. That's your job.
No, it's all good. Erica, what are your thoughts?
So I feel like there's no one right answer for this because every community is different and the answers will always be contextual. What may work for one community may not work for another. But something that Mead sort of spoke to was that as people who are going into communities and helping them, there are skills that are required of us that historically we may not have been trained to have. But something that I'm quite interested in, but also, me and Guillaume were on a call, and this person who was working on, floodplain planning talked about how they needed to have trauma-informed approaches to how they do this collaborative work with, different stakeholders. And for me, that was really interesting to hear that, there's this recognition that the issue of climate change is a threat multiplier, right? Especially for frontline communities. And we need to have an attunement, not just to like the issue of climate change, but as Amy was saying, like what threads do they pull on for each community? And that's not always physical. Some of it is really emotional and psychological. And, as a social scientist, I guess this is what I lean towards. But, I think especially for like frontline communities, there's layers of like trauma from systemic racism, trauma from being exposed to like climate hazards. And you come in and you're like, okay, how do we design the solutions? What science do you need? And the attunement to kind of like the sensitivity and being exposed to people's raw existential dread without them even realizing it or without you even touching on it sometimes, I think is, it's not necessarily an adaptation strategy, but it's something that no matter what the community is, we need to be going in with that kind of attunement or sensitivity.
Thanks, Erica. Crystal, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I think I'm not sure that what I'm going to say is going to be as eloquent as what Erica said, but I think in terms of answering the question on where do we see adaptation actions happening in local communities? I mean, there's two places that come to mind for me where I've really seen it accelerate. One is certainly wildfire. And that's in part because, adapting to wildfire isn't just a climate change issue. It's broader than that. There's a need to do more to adapt to wildfire in general. But we also do see that communities are recognizing that the role of wildfire in the Northwest is changing, and where we do it and how we adapt does need to change as a result of climate change. So that's an area where there's already a lot of need and a lot of traction, and we see it accelerating. And we also know, again, that looks very different in different communities in terms of what type of actions work within their community in terms of adapting to wildfire and how that's changing. And the other area that I want to mention is forestry. And I'm currently doing some work on looking at climate adaptation for small forest landowners. And this is, I think, the place where we've seen a big change. Even 5-10 years ago, talking about climate change impacts with small forest landowners was just a conversation that didn't get off the ground. There wasn't a lot of interest. And even in that short amount of time, we're seeing a big change in these landowners saying, tell me what to do. What can I do? What sort of action should I be taking? I have a forest and I want to see this forest continue to be healthy and function in a changing climate. And so I want to know what actions I can take. And we've seen a big shift there. And we're starting to see, people plant differently, manage forests differently, do things on the ground differently in recognition of that need. So I think those are two really tangible areas that we've seen some progress.
Guillaume, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's along the same lines as what Crystal was saying. A lot of my work has been in the water management side and flood management side. And I think there's a general recognition, similar to what Crystal was saying with respect to wildfire, that yes, climate change is a risk, but we're also not particularly well adapted to the current climate. And I think there's increasingly a sense or a recognition that a lot of the adaptations that are used for flooding, not all of them, are also going to increase resilience to climate change, and that the real question is, how do those actions get prioritized, or do they get prioritized differently in light of climate change? Do you focus on different parts of the river or different combinations of strategies? And I see that on the coastal side too with sea level rise. It's a lot of the same ideas, but maybe a reprioritization. So, it's not universally all, green infrastructure. Some of it is gray infrastructure, as we call it. And there's a mix of strategies, but it's not like there's new ideas in this area. It's like a different perspective on the value of what they're already doing and on the way you might prioritize one over the other.
Got it. Thanks, Guillaume. A question from the audience, Amy, was, and I was thinking about this too, the climate impacts group has so much knowledge, a ton of expertise. We've been hearing about an evolution over the last 25 years. I'm wondering how you grapple, and I can say this because I'm not a part of your group, so it might be too much of a political statement, but obviously in the federal level, we're just exiting a period where we had an administration that didn't really, science was not a foundation of that administration. Things may be shifting now, but I'm wondering, the question from the audience is sort of politics. We obviously need some laws to affect change. How do you kind of sometimes square those two, where facts and science, you're providing information, but sometimes decision makers aren't always taking advantage of the latest science?
It'd be great if I had an answer to that, wouldn't it? If I had
I get to ask the questions.
the solution to
Makes
that.
it easier for me, yeah.
Yeah. So,
or how framed differently, how well do you think the Pacific Northwest and Washington State are responding to science? Maybe that's a better way of asking it. How are we doing at a regional level? Take it out of the federal picture for a moment.
I'm a big booster of the Northwest and really proud of what we've been able to do here. I think that so I am speaking, right, very specifically about how folks in this region, the degree to which they're using the science or thinking about the science of how climate will affect the region and what we need to do to build resilience. And there is, I think this goes along with my happy secret story about the adaptation, is that there's a lot of climate science and use of climate science embedded in a lot of our agencies and governments that folks, would probably be surprised to hear. I think there's climate folks trained in climate science, climate impact science, who work at multiple agencies in the city of Seattle, multiple in King County, multiple in the state agencies, and there's a real interest in using the results of our work and others who do this kind of work to inform their decision making. I mean, the truth is that there's politics exist for a reason, right? That
sure.
Decisions, people have different values and different priorities, and there needs to be a forum for negotiating those. And so, not to go into too deep into where we are in the world right now, but I would say that, our mission is to then bring science to help assist those decisions. We have weathered the storms over the past 25 years by sticking to, to our role of providing science and supporting its use, while being really strong advocates for paying attention to science and what it tells us about where we're going in the future. So strong advocates for preparing for climate change, for addressing climate risks, for recognizing that until we reduce emissions, temperatures will go up forever. And then developing science and supporting its use in the decisions about how we're going to address those things.
Another question from the audience was that, the climate impacts group has, and as was evidenced by the 5 panelists, brings such a variety of expertise to this topic. Are there areas of expertise that you don't have that you wish that you had? And maybe some of the panelists might have a perspective on this too.
Yeah, well, I want to say one thing that we, let's see, I want to say a lot of things.
Yeah.
So I think we've shown that climate touches on all different aspects of life. We've talked a lot about different systems, rural, urban, bridges, creatures. And so to tackle all of this, you need lots of different expertise, as you said. For a long time, we had a big gaping hole in our expertise, which is that we didn't have an expert on fire. And, you can't really think about climate impacts in the Northwest without thinking about increasing wildfire risks. And so, Crystal mentioned that that's her expertise. And so that helped fill that hole. Another area that, we haven't talked about tonight that folks, is another area of concern is health, human health impacts of climate change. And that one, I would say we don't need to fill within our own group, because we have a sister group at the University of Washington that focuses on that, the Center for Health and the Global Environment. We collaborate with them a lot. So if you looked at our expertise on its own, we don't have the health. And then I would say that we need to keep growing our social science expertise. We were founded, Ed Miles, who founded us, was a scholar of international studies and political science. And he brought a real insight into how organizations work and how, in what cases new information can lead to change in the way decisions are made. And that's just one example. There's lots of different social science that we've already mentioned today about perception and trauma and all kinds of things. So I think, there's lots of room to grow in that social science arena.
Got it. I'm wondering, we have a little under 10 minutes left. I'm wondering if the panelists might be willing for like a lightning round, where there was an interesting question here about sort of like, how are each of you grappling with this topic of climate in your personal lives? So like what personal choices are you making in terms of your work and how you get around? So I'm wondering if each of you might be able to, like, briefly, like in a phrase, say, what are some choices you're making in your personal life? And then switching tracks, like what is giving you hope now more in the systemic level? So I'm going smaller personal, and then just like a phrase each. It's not going to be, we don't have time for a dissertation, unfortunately, but a phrase personal, and then what are you excited about big picture right now? Does anyone want to go first? Okay, I'm going to choose someone. I'm going to choose Andrew because we haven't. Okay, I'm going to choose Andrew.
I was going to say I go first.
Okay, go for it, Crystal.
So, I think in terms of, and personally, like where I live and how thoughts on climate change have affected that, I do know that I would not buy a house in a floodplain, and that I would be very, no offense, Guillaume, but I would be, I definitely think about that. And if I do think about living in a rural place, think about that wildfire hazard, think about those natural hazards. And there's a certain like responsibility in thinking about that, how that's changing. And then just, on the flip side of it is thinking about how to reduce commute and be close to, where you need to be, and keep your sort of world local. And then in terms of, being excited about the future, I think this, a lot of what Erica said, and really thinking about how we change who's involved and who's at the table and who makes decisions when we move forward. And one of the reasons that I came to work with the Climate Impacts Group is that I really value this notion of working with decision makers, and I have really put a lot of stock in that. And I've realized that decision makers are leaving out a lot of people in the world, and they represent a certain part of our society. And that's been a hard shift for me, but something that I really value learning how to work with more in the future as I do this work.
Thanks, Crystal. So I'll flip to you, Andrew, because we haven't heard from you in a bit.
Yeah, for me, the way this all reflects in my own personal life, I think, as an ecologist, everywhere I look, I just see interactions and cycles. And I think, as humans, we tend to think of us and our world and the natural world as very separate. And I think for me, in my own life, in my backyard, I garden, I compost, I have chickens, and there's cycles that form in my yard. And it forms, it's like a little local economy. And I find that rewarding. And it's also, I feel like, part of the solution to form cycles that are sustainable in our own lives.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you, Andrew. Erica, how about yourself?
I think that it's so hard. Like when I was, it feels almost like everything is an existential crisis, right? Like when you go to the grocery, it's like, which tomatoes do I buy? Or like, I really want bananas, but they only have bananas in plastic. And it's this, crazy thing where everywhere you look, it feels like, oh my gosh, this is an existential decision. And, something, it's not, I make my own personal and individual changes in my life to be more sustainable as much as possible. But, like 70% of the carbon emissions come from 100 companies. And for me, I feel that, the change that I make in my life is also activism outside of work and making sure that the people who are contributing to this problem are being held accountable. And I guess, on a more personal level, I think it's also having that kind of spiritual and emotional relationship with the land and nature that is really like healing for me and makes me feel connected to this work. On a broad scale, what I'm seeing is institutions and systems are really becoming more malleable to people power, the things that people have fought for such a long amount of time, like the indigenous communities who have fought like literally like hundreds of years for this. We're starting to see that they're being heard and being given voice. There's still a long way to go, but I find that like really hopeful.
Thanks so much, Erica. I'd concur. I mean, there seems to be a sort of tremendous shift going on in that way, which is so exciting. How about you, Guillaume?
So lately, my focus, I think everything everybody said are the same kinds of things I think about. But lately, my focus has been on promoting the bird population in our backyard. So I learned a bunch about nest boxes. Found out actually in the city they're not that useful. So now we're trying to cultivate plants and other aspects of our garden that bring in insects, because that's food for the birds and other pollinators and stuff like that. So that's the local thing for me lately. More globally, the thing that has been giving me hope lately are the transitions that are happening almost without any or kind of organically, I guess, not without any input, but like I think the fact that renewable energy has gotten so much cheaper, right? And there are of course places where deforestation is a problem, but there's also places where major reforestation is happening, right? And it's not enough, but it's already great, and it's nice to see.
Thanks. How about you, Mead?
So on the local scale, I also do a lot of things that other people have mentioned. So I got the chickens, I got the garden. I don't really fly for pleasure unless I need to. And that's not to make anyone feel guilty. It's just that I'm at a point where I don't want to give the oil companies any more of my money. And I recognize that as a relatively, on the global scheme of things, relatively wealthy person of the global north. Like, I know that we are producing most of the carbon. And so I have the privilege of choosing, to try to limit my own emissions while recognizing, as Erica said, that there are structural reasons that it's really hard to live a low carbon lifestyle. And those are the structures that we need to be focusing our energies on. It's on getting laws in place that will make the transition happen to clean energy sooner. So I try to be gentle with myself, even as I hold myself accountable and recognizing where the real problem is and making sure we have change there. And also I saw someone note about like where you live. And like I just also want to say that I wasn't joking about the centering community and justice thing, like in choosing, like, I think you want to have this feeling of, fear makes you want to bunker down, like find the safe place to hide. That's not how we're getting out of this. It's just not, it's the exact opposite. So really reminding myself when I feel that way, like, where can I hide? No, open, community, forward. And as far as hope, or what I'd like to see moving forward, or what gives me hope right now, we are starting to see like the social movements globally that are going to be required to force the action that we need to happen to make the transition to clean energy and to decarbonize. That gives me a lot of hope. I hate that it's the children and the youth that are driving this, because it's so desperately unfair, and yet it's happening. We're getting the numbers that we need to see globally happening. So I have a lot of hope that change is coming, and it is coming. We're seeing it happen with this election, and this week we have a climate plan coming out from the White House. So things are happening. It's good.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mead. Amy, I think I'll hand it back to you, but I just wanted to express my hand it to you to wrap up. But I just wanted to express my gratitude and appreciation for everything all 6 of you are doing. And I'm definitely leaving this time together with kind of an increased understanding of the complexity of these issues and of the climate impact group's work, and just this enthusiasm for all that you're up to. And I guess I would just conclude by saying, as someone who's, you know, kind of been in the space forever, Bill McKibben was my first babysitter when I was 3 and 4. I just think change is happening so rapidly right now. I mean, whether it's in the energy space or transportation, built environment. And so we're talking about changing away from an entire energy system. And, you know, I think that we're so much further ahead now in awareness and the work going on than we were even a decade ago. It's just the pace is picking up. So that just gives me tremendous hope. And the work that you guys are just doing is so important. So I'll hand it to you, Amy, to wrap up, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Chip. Thanks for being with us tonight and helping us organize our conversation and bringing all these good questions. I want to thank every single one of my colleagues who gave these very short, pithy presentations this evening, and are the front of the even bigger organization. I mean, we shouldn't fail to note that the Climate Impacts Group is bigger than the 6 of us, and we all are a team that works together on all of these projects, and so there's even more good work than we could even share with you this evening. I want to, you know, thank people for being here on the other side of the screen and listening and being interested in the topic, and hopefully a shout out to some of the Climate Impacts Group alumni who might have joined us tonight, and to our partners in efforts to build resilience and folks who wanted to know more about the topic. I also wanted to thank our staff who did all that, you know, nail-biting work behind the scenes to make sure that we showed up in the right place and the feed worked and all those things that are a lot of work and nerve-wracking when you're in charge of running a webinar for a lot of people. So here we are, you know, we've made huge progress in these 25 years. We have so much to be proud of, and we're learning more every day about how to do our next work even better, right? We talked about broadening our communities, expanding our collaboration, finding that hope and partnership that people put in there earlier, in that word cloud that we created earlier, and moving forward. So I didn't answer the question as to, you know, what brings me hope, but I'm going to. And what brings me hope is knowing that there are all these amazing people that you see on your screen here who are working really hard to advance climate resilience in our world. And the team at the Climate Impacts Group and all of our partners in the world, in our local governments, state governments, our tribal partners, everyone who is looking at the future and the changes that are coming and figuring out what they can do to help build resilience so that we can all thrive. That is what gives me hope, the fact that those all exist. And I look forward to our next 25 years of doing that good work together. So I want to thank you for joining us, and please stay in touch. Have a nice evening.